The biggest mistake a man can make in prison is believing that silence means weakness. The transport bus rolled through the final security gate just after sunrise, its old engine rumbling beneath layers of rust and dust collected from 1,000 lonely miles of highway. Inside, nobody spoke. The handful of inmates being transferred stared through the narrow reinforced windows as Redstone Correctional Facility slowly came into view. High fences stretched across the horizon. Concrete walls rose above them like cliffs. Guard towers watched every angle with quiet patience. For most men, it was the end of one life and the beginning of another. For Marcus Carter, it was simply another place. The bus stopped. One by one, the prisoners stepped down and lined up for processing. Some looked nervous. Others tried to appear tougher than they felt. Marcus didn't either. He carried a small canvas bag in one hand and stood quietly near the end of the line, his eyes moving across the yard with the calm attention of someone studying a map. He was over 6 feet tall, broad across the shoulders, but there was nothing threatening about the way he carried himself. His gray prison uniform fit loosely. His face showed the faint lines of a man who had lived through difficult years without letting them harden him. Officer Daniel Ross stood near the entrance checking paperwork. He had worked corrections for nearly 3 decades. Thousands of inmates had passed through his hands, and after enough years, every face became another file. Yet when Marcus stepped forward, Ross stopped writing. Something about the new transfer felt familiar. Not the face, not the name on the paperwork. Something else. The way he stood. His posture was relaxed but balanced. His breathing never changed. Even the noise of barking orders and slamming gates seemed unable to reach him. Ross looked down at the transfer file. Marcus Carter, 41 years old. New arrival. Nothing unusual. He looked back up, but the strange feeling remained. Somewhere deep in his memory, he had seen that quiet confidence before. Marcus collected his assigned belongings without asking questions. A blanket, a toothbrush, a plastic cup, the same things every inmate received. Another officer pointed him toward C block. You will find your cell assignment inside. Marcus nodded once and started walking. The long corridor echoed beneath his footsteps. Steel doors closed behind him one after another. Conversations drifted through the bars of nearby cells. Some inmates ignored him. Others watched openly. New arrivals always attracted attention. People wanted to know who they were, where they came from, and whether they would survive. At the center table, near the common area, sat Logan Hayes. The unofficial ruler of C Block leaned back in his chair, while 3 other inmates stood nearby laughing at something only they understood. Logan had spent years building his reputation. He believed every new transfer needed to learn the rules before sunset. One of his friends noticed Marcus first. Looks like we got fresh company. Logan glanced toward the corridor. Marcus kept walking without changing pace. He did not lower his eyes. He did not stare back. He simply continued forward, carrying the small canvas bag over one shoulder. Logan stood up slowly. That one does not seem nervous. Another inmate grinned. Maybe nobody told him where he is. Logan smiled. Then we should welcome him. Several men followed as he walked across the block. Conversations began fading. Card games stopped. Even the television mounted on the wall seemed quieter than before. Ethan Brooks, a young inmate cleaning tables nearby, noticed the crowd gathering and stepped back. He had seen this happen too many times. New men arrived. Logan cornered them. By the next morning, everyone understood who was in charge. Marcus reached the far end of the corridor where the cell assignments were posted. He set his bag down and quietly read the list. Behind him, footsteps echoed across the concrete floor. Logan and his group stopped only a few feet away, spreading out just enough to block the path back. Ethan watched from the common area. Several other inmates pretended not to look. Up on the second level, Officer Ross stepped out of the control office and saw the small crowd forming below. For reasons he could not explain, his heart beat a little faster. Marcus turned around slowly. His expression never changed. Logan folded his arms and smiled. You picked the wrong block, new guy. Marcus looked at the faces around him, then at the walls, then at the heavy steel door leading back toward the yard. Finally, his eyes returned to Logan. He lifted the canvas bag from the floor and held it at his side. Maybe, he said quietly, or maybe I just arrived exactly where I was supposed to be. High above the block, Officer Ross felt an old memory trying to break through the fog of time, and for the first time in many years, He found himself wondering if the quiet man standing alone in that hallway was not a stranger at all. The hallway remained silent for several long seconds after Marcus Carter spoke. Nobody expected confidence from a new transfer, especially not the quiet kind. Most men tried to impress people when they arrived at C Block. They talked too much, stared too hard, or acted tougher than they felt. Marcus did none of those things. He simply stood there holding the small canvas bag while Logan Hayes and his group blocked the corridor. Ethan Brooks watched from across the room, his hands still resting on the cleaning cart. He had seen this same moment play out many times before. Usually the new inmate would apologize, look for another way around, or ask someone for help. Marcus did not move at all. Logan looked him up and down with a slow smile. "You think this is funny?" Marcus looked at the older inmate with calm eyes. "No." Logan folded his arms. "Then maybe you should explain yourself." Marcus glanced toward the cell assignment board beside him. "I came here to find my cell." One of the men standing behind Logan laughed. "You found something else instead." A few nervous chuckles spread across the block, but they disappeared almost immediately. There was something unusual about the way Marcus answered questions. He never sounded afraid, but he never sounded angry either. It was as though he had already lived through moments much bigger than this one. Up on the second level, Officer Daniel Ross continued watching from the control office window. The strange feeling inside him had only grown stronger. He knew he had seen that kind of composure before. Years ago, somewhere far away from prison walls and security gates. He looked back down at the transfer paperwork sitting beside the radio. Marcus Carter, 41 years old. Nothing remarkable. Ross frowned. The file and the man standing below did not seem to belong together. Logan took one slow step closer. "You should know something about this block." Marcus waited quietly. "People here earn their place." Marcus nodded once. "That sounds fair." Logan seemed almost disappointed by the answer. "You are not asking how." Marcus looked around the hallway. Old paint peeled from the walls. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Inmates watched from behind steel bars, pretending not to care. Finally, he looked back at Logan. "I usually learn by paying attention." Ethan could not explain why, but those words stayed with him. Most people arrived in prison trying to prove something. This new transfer looked like a man trying to understand something instead. Logan glanced at the canvas bag in Marcus's hand. "What do you have in there?" Marcus looked down at it. "A few things that belong to me." "Set it down." Marcus gently placed the bag on the floor without argument. Logan nodded toward one of his friends. The younger inmate stepped forward, reached down, and opened the bag. Inside there was a folded blanket, a toothbrush, 2 paperback books, and a small family photograph turned face down. The inmate looked confused. "That is it." Marcus smiled faintly. "It is enough." Logan picked up one of the books and looked at the worn cover. It was an old copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. "You like reading?" Marcus answered softly. "Good stories help people survive difficult places." Logan tossed the book back into the bag. "This is not a library." Marcus looked at him for a moment. "No, but there are still people here." The hallway grew quiet again. Ethan noticed several inmates looking at each other. Nobody knew exactly why, but the conversation felt different now. Logan had spent years controlling the block through confidence and reputation. Yet somehow this quiet stranger was standing completely alone without trying to impress anyone. Officer Ross stepped out of the control office and slowly started down the stairs. He did not know why his feet were moving. He only knew that the new transfer reminded him of someone he had not thought about in a very long time. Marcus reached down, picked up the canvas bag, and carefully placed the books back inside. Then he looked at Logan one last time. "Could you tell me where cell 27 is?" Logan opened his mouth to answer, but no words came out. For the first time since Ethan Brooks had arrived at Redstone, he watched the unofficial leader of C Block hesitate. And somewhere deep inside his memory, Officer Daniel Ross finally began to hear the distant echo of a crowd cheering beneath bright lights many years ago. The hallway slowly came back to life after Marcus Carter picked up his canvas bag and walked away. Conversations returned in low voices. A television somewhere near the common area started playing an afternoon game show. Metal doors opened and closed as officers continued their rounds. But something inside C Block had changed, and everyone seemed to feel it without understanding why. Ethan Brooks watched Marcus disappear down the corridor towards cell 27. The new transfer walked at the same steady pace as before, carrying the old bag over one shoulder as though the entire encounter had been nothing more than a short conversation. Ethan had seen men leave that hallway with anger, fear, or embarrassment written across their faces. Marcus carried none of those things. Officer Daniel Ross reached the bottom of the stairs just as Marcus unlocked his assigned cell. For a brief second their eyes met. Marcus gave a polite nod. Ross returned it almost without thinking. The old correctional officer stood there for another moment after the cell door closed, trying to understand why his chest suddenly felt heavy. Somewhere inside his memory, there was a loud arena filled with people. Bright lights. A ring surrounded by cheering crowds. He could almost hear the noise, but the picture vanished before he could hold on to it. "You all right, Ross?" another officer asked as he walked by. Daniel looked back towards cell 27. "Yeah," he answered quietly. "I just thought I recognized someone." The afternoon passed slowly. Ethan finally gathered enough courage to walk toward the new transfer cell. Marcus was sitting on the lower bunk with one of the paperback books open in his hands. The small family photograph rested beside him. Ethan stopped outside the bars. "Mind if I ask you something?" Marcus looked up and smiled gently. "You can always ask." Ethan hesitated. "Why did you not argue with Logan?" Marcus closed the book and placed it beside him. "Would it have helped?" Ethan shrugged. "Maybe not." Marcus nodded. "Most people think every problem needs a louder voice. Sometimes it only needs patience." Ethan leaned against the bars. "You are different from the others who come here." Marcus looked around the small cell. "Everybody is different. Most people just spend too much time pretending they are the same." Ethan laughed softly. He liked the way the older man answered questions. Nothing sounded forced. Nothing sounded like a speech. It felt more like someone talking from experience. Across the block, Logan Hayes sat at the card table with the same group of men who usually surrounded him. One of them finally broke the silence. "You should have put that new guy in his place." Logan looked down at the deck of cards in his hand. "Maybe." Another inmate shook his head. "Nobody talks to you like that." Logan slowly placed the cards on the table. "He did not talk to me." The others looked confused. Logan stared toward the hallway leading to cell 27. "He talked like he already knew something the rest of us do not." Nobody answered. They all felt it too. Up in the administration office, Daniel Ross sat alone during his break. He opened an old metal cabinet and searched through a stack of faded magazines he had collected over the years. Sports, boxing, wrestling, local newspapers. He did not know exactly what he was looking for, only that his memory refused to let go. After several minutes, he found an old magazine with a torn cover. A photograph showed two competitors standing under bright arena lights while thousands of people filled the seats behind them. The image was grainy, and one face was hidden by shadows. But something about the man's posture made Ross stop breathing for a second. Calm, balanced, completely relaxed while everyone around him looked tense. Ross slowly sat down in his chair. He turned the page, but the article had been ripped out years ago. The name was gone. The story was gone. Only the photograph remained. Down in cell 27, Marcus carefully placed the family picture back inside his canvas bag and looked through the narrow window toward the fading evening sky. Ethan stood to leave, but stopped at the door. "Can I ask one last thing?" Marcus looked at him. "Of course." Ethan smiled awkwardly. "Are you really not afraid of Logan?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he looked toward the long corridor outside the cell. "Fear is not the hardest thing to live with," he said softly. "Forgetting who you are is much worse." Ethan walked away thinking about those words. High above the block, Officer Daniel Ross stared at the old photograph in his hands. And for the first time in almost 20 years, he began to wonder if the quiet new transfer in cell 27 had once belonged to a world that very few people ever got to see. Morning arrived at Redstone Correctional Facility with the familiar sound of steel doors unlocking and officers calling out the daily count. Thin rays of sunlight slipped through the narrow windows high above C-block, drawing pale lines across the concrete floor. Most inmates shuffled through the routine without thinking. They knew exactly where to stand, when to move, and when to stay quiet. Marcus Carter stepped out of cell 27 carrying one of the old paperback books under his arm. Ethan Brooks was already waiting outside. "You really read before breakfast?" he asked. Marcus smiled. "A quiet mind usually starts with a quiet morning." Ethan shook his head with a small laugh. "I have never met anyone like you." Marcus looked down the corridor where dozens of inmates were beginning to form a line. "Most people have. They just do not notice." The two men joined the line toward the cafeteria. Along the way, Marcus nodded politely to an older inmate struggling to carry his tray. The man looked surprised but nodded back. Ethan noticed little things like that. Marcus never seemed interested in making an impression, yet people remembered him anyway. Across the block, Logan Hayes leaned against the railing on the second level, watching the new transfer below. One of his friends stepped beside him. "You going to let him keep acting like he owns the place?" Logan looked down at Marcus, talking quietly with Ethan. "Does he look like he is trying to own anything?" The other inmate frowned. "Then what is he doing?" Logan did not answer. That was exactly the question that had stayed with him all night. In the cafeteria, Marcus sat at an empty table near the far wall and opened his book while waiting for breakfast to begin. Ethan placed his tray across from him. "Do you always carry that thing?" Marcus looked at the worn cover. "My father used to say that every difficult place feels smaller when you have a good story with you." Ethan smiled. "My father used to tell me to stay out of trouble." Marcus closed the book. "That is a good story too." Nearby, a young inmate reached for a carton of milk. At the same moment, another prisoner accidentally bumped the edge of the serving counter. The carton slipped from his hand and started falling toward the floor. Before Ethan even realized what had happened, Marcus reached out and caught it without spilling a single drop. The movement was smooth, almost effortless. Marcus simply handed the carton back to the surprised inmate and continued his conversation. Ethan stared at him. "How did you do that?" Marcus looked down at his coffee. Years of paying attention. Ethan looked around the cafeteria. Nobody else seemed to have noticed except one person. Officer Daniel Ross stood near the entrance with a clipboard in his hand. The old correctional officer had seen the entire thing. His heart skipped for a moment. The speed, the timing, the way Marcus moved without wasting a single motion. Ross had seen it before. He knew he had. The old magazine was still sitting on his desk upstairs. He could almost see the faded photograph in his mind. A competitor standing beneath bright lights. Calm while everyone else looked nervous. Ross walked slowly toward the cafeteria office without saying a word. Logan had noticed it too. He had spent years watching people inside prison. Fear made men clumsy. Anger made them careless. Marcus had shown neither. Logan sat down across the room and kept watching the new transfer. Ethan finally lowered his voice. "You have done something like that before, have you not?" Marcus took a sip of coffee before answering. "Everybody practices something in life." "What did you practice?" Marcus looked out the cafeteria window where the morning sun was climbing above the prison fence. A faint smile crossed his face. "Keeping my balance." Ethan laughed softly. "That sounds too simple." Marcus nodded. "The most important things usually are." Up in the administration office, Daniel Ross opened the old magazine again. This time he looked more carefully at the grainy photograph. One corner of the page had folded over with age. He gently pulled it back, revealing a single line of faded print beneath the picture. The words were almost impossible to read, but one part stood out clearly enough to make him stop breathing. Underground Championship Finals. Ross slowly lowered the magazine onto the desk and looked through the office window toward the cafeteria below. Marcus Carter was still sitting quietly with a book in his hands, looking like an ordinary inmate. But somewhere deep inside his memory, Daniel Ross knew that ordinary men did not move the way that new transfer had just moved. By the time the afternoon work period began, the story of the new transfer had already spread across C Block. Nobody knew exactly what they were talking about, which only made the rumors grow faster. Some inmates claimed Marcus Carter had been military. Others believed he had worked private security somewhere out west. A few simply said there was something different about him. Ethan Brooks walked beside Marcus toward the prison library carrying a small cart filled with returned books. "People are talking about you," Ethan said. Marcus adjusted the stack of books before answering. "People usually create stories when they do not know the truth." Ethan smiled. "So what is the truth?" Marcus looked down the long hallway. "The truth is usually much less interesting than the story." Ethan laughed softly, but he noticed that Marcus never actually answered the question. The library sat at the far end of the education wing, one of the quietest places inside Redstone. Old shelves lined the walls, filled with worn paperbacks and faded history books that had passed through countless hands over the years. Marcus stopped at one shelf and carefully returned the novel he had finished that morning. Mrs. Eleanor Price, the elderly volunteer who managed the library, smiled when she saw him. "Finished already?" Marcus nodded. "A good book deserves a little attention." She handed him another novel from behind the desk. Then perhaps this one is ready for yours. Ethan watched the exchange with curiosity. Most inmates rushed through the library. Marcus treated it like a place that mattered. Across the corridor, Logan Hayes stood with two of his friends watching through the glass window. One of them folded his arms. You really going to let him walk around like he belongs here? Logan kept his eyes on Marcus. Have you ever seen somebody so calm? The other inmate shrugged. Maybe he is pretending. Logan slowly shook his head. No, men pretending usually want you to notice. Inside the library, Marcus thanked Mrs. Price and placed the new book under his arm. As he turned away, a stack of old magazines slipped from the corner of a nearby table. They slid toward the floor. Before Ethan could even reach out, Marcus calmly caught the top few copies and steadied the pile with one hand. Mrs. Price smiled. Good reflexes. Marcus gently placed the magazines back in order. Sometimes paying attention saves work later. Ethan stared at him. It was the second time in 2 days he had seen Marcus react before anyone else even realized something was happening. Up in the administration office, Officer Daniel Ross sat with the old sports magazine open across his desk. The faded headline still haunted him. Underground Championship Finals. He had spent his lunch break searching old memories instead of eating. 20 years earlier, before becoming a correctional officer, Ross had spent a weekend in Atlantic City with some friends. They had wandered into a private sporting event held in an old warehouse near the docks. No cameras, no advertisements, just thousands of people packed around a brightly lit ring cheering for two competitors. Ross had almost forgotten the night entirely. Almost. He reached into the magazine and looked more carefully at the grainy photograph. One face was still hidden by shadows, but beneath it was a single line that age had nearly erased. Undefeated challenger enters the final match. Ross slowly leaned back in his chair. He still could not see the name, but he remembered something else. The challenger had walked into the arena exactly the way Marcus Carter had walked into C Block. Calm, silent, completely balanced. A knock came at the office door. Warden Michael Grant stepped inside. You look like you have seen a ghost. Ross closed the magazine. Maybe I have. The warden looked toward the yard below. Something about the new transfer? Ross hesitated for a moment. Then he looked back at the old photograph. I think I have seen that man before. Down in the library, Ethan finally asked the question that had been sitting in his mind all day. What did you do before you came here? Marcus looked at the old book in his hands. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he smiled softly. I spent a lot of years learning that people cheer for winners. Ethan waited. Marcus looked through the library window toward the quiet prison yard beyond the fences. Eventually, I discovered that teaching someone else to stand up is worth much more than hearing strangers clap for you. Ethan did not fully understand the answer, but somewhere above them, Officer Daniel Ross stared at the faded magazine cover and realized he was getting closer to a memory that had never completely disappeared. That evening, a light rain began falling outside the prison walls, tapping softly against the narrow windows of C Block. Most inmates barely noticed. Days inside Redstone blurred together until weather became little more than a change in the color of the sky. Marcus Carter stood by the window outside the library for a few quiet moments before evening count. His new book rested beneath one arm while he watched the rain drift across the yard. Ethan Brooks walked up beside him. You miss being outside? Marcus smiled without taking his eyes from the window. I miss the feeling that tomorrow can surprise you. Ethan looked at the empty yard below. Does it still? Marcus nodded. Every day. The younger inmate thought about that answer as they started walking back toward the cell block. Somewhere ahead, Logan Hayes and two of his friends were standing near the common area. The conversation around them slowly faded as Marcus approached. Logan watched the older man carefully. The rumors had only grown stronger. Some inmates believed Marcus had been a professional athlete. Others thought he had worked security for famous people. Nobody knew the truth, but everyone agreed on one thing. The new transfer did not act like a man carrying fear. Logan stepped into the hallway. You spend a lot of time reading. Marcus looked at the book in his hand. It helps pass the hours. Logan folded his arms. I never understood why people waste time with stories. Marcus looked around the block. Men sat playing cards. Others stared at the television without really watching it. A few simply looked through the bars of their cells. Stories remind people that life can become something different, he answered quietly. Logan looked at him for a long second. You always talk like you already know how things end. Marcus shook his head gently. No, I just know they always change. Ethan noticed that nobody around them was moving. Even the guards seemed to be paying attention without making it obvious. Officer Daniel Ross stood near the upper railing with the old magazine folded under his arm. He had spent the last hour searching the prison archive computer for old newspaper articles, but the underground sporting events from years ago had almost disappeared from public record. One small article had survived. Most of the photograph was damaged, but a single sentence remained. The undefeated champion never celebrated victory. Ross had read that line at least 10 times. It matched the quiet man walking below him far too well. Warden Michael Grant stepped onto the upper level and noticed the magazine in Ross's hand. You were still thinking about that new transfer. Ross nodded slowly. I cannot explain it. The warden looked down toward Marcus. You think he is somebody important? Ross hesitated. I think he used to be. Grant folded his hands behind his back. Then why would a man like that end up here? Ross looked through the rain-covered window toward the darkening sky. Sometimes the strongest people carry stories nobody else ever hears. Down below, Marcus and Ethan reached the staircase leading toward cell 27. Ethan looked at the older man. Can I ask you something? Marcus smiled. You usually do. Ethan lowered his voice. Were you famous? Marcus stopped walking for the first time all day. He looked out through the narrow window where the rain continued falling over the prison yard. Fame is a strange thing, he said quietly. People cheer for you one day and forget your name the next. Ethan waited. Marcus looked back at him. Character lasts much longer. Before Ethan could ask another question, a loud crash echoed from the far end of the corridor. A maintenance cart had rolled into the wall after one of its wheels caught a crack in the floor. Cleaning supplies scattered across the hallway. Several inmates stepped around the mess without slowing down. Marcus handed his book to Ethan and quietly walked over. He picked up a fallen broom, gathered the bottles, and helped the older maintenance worker stack everything back onto the cart. The man looked embarrassed. Thank you, he said softly. Marcus simply smiled. Everybody needs a hand once in a while. Officer Daniel Ross watched the entire moment from above. Suddenly, another memory returned. The old arena. Thousands of people standing and cheering. Bright lights shining down on a lone competitor. After the event ended, Ross remembered seeing that same man helping workers fold chairs instead of celebrating in the center of the building. The old correctional officer slowly looked down at Marcus Carter and felt his heart beat a little faster. Somewhere inside the fading corners of his memory, the face was finally beginning to come into focus. The next morning the rain had disappeared, leaving the prison yard covered in a thin layer of mist that slowly faded beneath the rising sun. Redstone Correctional Facility looked almost peaceful from the narrow windows of C Block, but everyone inside knew peace rarely lasted long. Marcus Carter was already awake when the first count bell echoed through the building. He sat quietly on the lower bunk with his new library book resting on one knee. Ethan Brooks climbed down from the top bunk and rubbed his eyes. Do you ever sleep? Marcus looked up with a small smile. Enough to appreciate the morning. Ethan stretched and looked through the small window. I stopped appreciating mornings a long time ago. Marcus closed the book. Then today might be a good day to start again. They walked toward breakfast together. Along the way, Marcus greeted the older maintenance worker from the night before with a simple nod. The man smiled back immediately. Ethan noticed more people were beginning to do the same. It was not admiration exactly. It was something quieter. Respect that had not been asked for. Across the upper level, Logan Hayes watched everything from the railing. One of his friends stepped beside him. People are starting to like him. Logan kept his eyes on Marcus. No. Then what is it? Logan thought for a moment. They trust him. The answer surprised even him. Trust was not something Logan understood very well. In his world, people followed strength because they feared what happened if they did not. Yet the new transfer had done nothing except read books, help strangers, and answer questions calmly. Somehow that seemed to matter more. In the cafeteria, Ethan and Marcus sat at the same table they always used. Marcus unfolded his napkin and reached for his coffee. Before he could take a sip, Logan walked over alone. The room slowly grew quieter. Ethan looked around and realized almost everyone was watching without pretending otherwise. Logan stood beside the table with his hands in his pockets. Mind if I sit down? Marcus looked at the empty chair across from him. It was made for somebody. Logan pulled it out and sat. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Logan looked at the old book resting beside Marcus's tray. You always have one of those with you. Marcus nodded. Most days. Logan leaned back in the chair. You know what I think? Marcus waited. I think people use books because they want to escape reality. Marcus looked around the cafeteria. Men eating quietly. Guards walking their usual routes. Sunlight slipping through the high windows. Sometimes people read because they want to understand reality. Logan looked at him carefully. You always answer like that? Marcus smiled. Only when somebody asks. A few inmates quietly laughed. Logan noticed it, but for the first time he did not seem angry. Instead, he studied the older man sitting across from him. Where did you learn to stay so calm? Marcus picked up his coffee cup. A long time ago somebody taught me that losing control is usually the fastest way to lose everything else. Logan folded his arms. Who taught you? Marcus looked into the dark coffee for a moment. Life has many teachers. Up in the administration office, Officer Daniel Ross sat staring at the old magazine again. He had searched public archives before coming to work that morning. Most of the underground events had never been officially recorded, but one retired sports writer had published a personal blog years later. Ross had found a single photograph from the championship night. The picture was clearer than the magazine image. Two competitors stood in the center of a ring while thousands of people filled the background. One of them had his back turned to the camera. Ross felt his heart begin to race. The posture was identical. Shoulders relaxed, hands resting naturally at his sides. Completely calm while everyone around him looked excited. The old officer closed the computer and stood up. Warden Michael Grant noticed him walking toward the door. Where are you going? Ross looked through the office window toward the cafeteria below. Marcus Carter was sitting quietly, talking to Logan Hayes as though they had known each other for years. I think I am about to remember something important, Ross answered softly. Down in the cafeteria, Logan stood up from the table. He looked at Marcus one last time before turning away. As he walked back toward his usual group, Ethan leaned forward and lowered his voice. I think he was trying to figure you out. Marcus opened his book again. Most people are really trying to figure themselves out. Ethan looked confused. Marcus smiled without looking up from the page. They just do not realize it yet. And from the second floor above them, Officer Daniel Ross watched the quiet new transfer and finally accepted a thought that had seemed impossible only a day before. The man sitting in C block was not simply somebody who had seen the underground championship. Somehow, against all reason, he had been standing at the very center of it. That afternoon, the prison yard opened for recreation under a clear blue sky. The rain from the night before had washed the air clean, and a cool breeze carried dry leaves across the cracked pavement between the fences. Groups of inmates spread out across the yard, some walking slow circles around the track, others sitting at old metal tables talking quietly. Marcus Carter stepped outside with Ethan Brooks and carried the same paperback book beneath his arm. Ethan looked around and smiled. This is probably the closest thing we have to freedom. Marcus glanced toward the wide sky above the walls. Sometimes freedom begins long before a door opens. Ethan laughed softly. You really do have an answer for everything. Marcus shook his head. Only for the things life has already taught me. Across the yard, Logan Hayes stood near the handball court watching them. The conversation from breakfast had stayed in his mind all day. Nobody had ever spoken to him the way Marcus had. The older man never challenged him, but somehow Logan always walked away feeling as though he had been the one being tested. One of his friends stepped beside him. You talked to him this morning. Logan nodded. What do you think? Logan looked across the yard where Marcus had stopped to help an older inmate carry a folded chair to one of the tables. I think he has spent his whole life doing something very difficult. Like what? Logan answered without looking away. Staying calm. Up in the administration office, Officer Daniel Ross was not watching the yard. He was sitting alone with a telephone in front of him. The old magazine and the printed article lay spread across his desk. After reading them again and again, he had finally decided to call somebody from his past. The line rang twice before an older voice answered. Richard Cole speaking. Ross sat up straighter. Mr. Cole, you probably do not remember me. My name is Daniel Ross. I met you at a sporting event almost 20 years ago. There was a short silence. That was a long time ago, son. What can I do for you? Ross looked down at the old photograph. I think I might have met one of your fighters again. The silence on the other end grew longer. Finally, Richard spoke. Who? Ross hesitated. I am not sure. He picked up the magazine and looked at the hidden face. But I remember he never celebrated. I remember he helped people clean up after the event. Richard let out a slow breath. Not many men would remember that. Ross looked out the office window toward the prison yard. Marcus was sitting alone now, reading quietly while the rest of the inmates filled the yard with noise. Would you remember him if you saw him? Richard answered immediately. Some people you never forget. Down below, Ethan sat beside Marcus at the metal table. Can I ask you another question? Marcus closed his book. You usually do. Ethan pointed toward the handball court where Logan and his friends were standing. Why do you think he keeps watching you? Marcus followed his eyes. Logan looked away the moment he realized he had been noticed. Marcus smiled faintly. People pay attention when something does not fit the story they already believe. Ethan frowned. What story? Marcus looked around the prison yard. That strength always has to be loud. Before Ethan could answer, a basketball rolled across the yard and bounced toward their table. Marcus reached out and caught it smoothly with one hand before it touched the ground. A younger inmate jogged over to collect it. Marcus handed him the ball with a smile. Nice catch, the young man said. Marcus simply nodded. Logan had seen it from across the yard. So had Officer Ross through the office window. The movement had been almost too fast to notice. No wasted effort. No sudden motion. Just perfect timing. Ross slowly lowered the telephone receiver back onto the desk. Richard Cole had asked him one final question before hanging up. Tell me one thing about the man you saw. Ross had looked down at the yard before answering. He moves like the world around him is slower than everybody else. Richard had been quiet for several seconds. Then he spoke in a voice so soft Ross almost missed it. If that is who I think it is, tell me where he is. I have been hoping to meet that man again for many years. Ross looked out toward Marcus Carter sitting peacefully with a book in his hands, and for the first time he realized that somebody far beyond the walls of Redstone Correctional Facility might already know exactly who the quiet new transfer really was. The evening recreation period ended just before sunset, and the inmates of C Block slowly made their way back inside. The golden light outside faded behind the fences, leaving long shadows across the concrete walkways. Marcus Carter walked beside Ethan Brooks carrying his paperback book under one arm, moving with the same quiet pace he had shown since arriving at Redstone. Ethan glanced toward him. You know, people are starting to make up stories about you. Marcus smiled. People usually do that when they do not know someone. Ethan laughed softly. One guy thinks you used to be a famous athlete. Marcus looked toward the darkening sky. Everybody used to be something. What about you? Ethan asked. Marcus thought for a moment before answering. I used to believe that winning solved everything. Ethan waited for him to continue, but Marcus simply smiled and kept walking. Across the corridor, Logan Hayes stood near the entrance to the cell block with 3 of his closest friends. He had watched Marcus all afternoon. The older man never hurried, never looked nervous, never acted like he wanted trouble. Somehow that only made Logan more curious. As Marcus and Ethan approached, Logan stepped forward and quietly blocked the hallway. This time, there was no laughter from the other inmates. No loud jokes. The entire block seemed to fall silent on its own. Ethan stopped walking. Marcus stopped beside him. Logan looked directly at the older man. I have been thinking about what you said. Marcus waited patiently. You told me people pay attention when something does not fit the story they believe. Marcus nodded once. Logan folded his arms. So tell me your story. Marcus looked around the block. Men stood outside their cells pretending not to watch. Guards walked their usual routes, but even they seemed quieter. Finally, Marcus looked back at Logan. Stories are not very useful if somebody else tells them for you. Logan frowned. Then who should? Marcus answered softly. Time usually does a better job. The words stayed hanging in the air. Logan shook his head with a small smile. You really are different. Marcus picked up his canvas bag from beside the wall. No. Logan looked surprised. Marcus glanced toward the long hallway stretching behind them. Everybody has a story they carry. Most people are simply afraid to let others see it. Up on the second level, Officer Daniel Ross had been watching the conversation from the control station window. His telephone sat on the desk beside him. Only 30 minutes earlier, Richard Cole had called back. The retired trainer had asked dozens of questions. How tall was the man? How old did he look? Did he speak loudly or quietly? Did he ever seem angry? Ross had answered each one. Before ending the call, Richard had been silent for several seconds. Then he said something Ross could not stop thinking about. If his name is Marcus Carter, then there was never anybody better. Ross slowly looked down toward the hallway below. Marcus was walking away from Logan now, completely calm, as though nothing important had happened. Richard's words echoed through his mind. There was never anybody better. Warden Michael Grant stepped into the office carrying a stack of paperwork. He noticed Ross staring through the window. Still thinking about the new transfer? Ross nodded. I talked to somebody who knew him. The warden raised an eyebrow. And Ross looked back down at Marcus. I do not think anybody here understands who just walked into this prison. Down in the block, Ethan caught up with Marcus near cell 27. Can I ask you one more thing? Marcus smiled. I thought that was the last question. Ethan laughed. This one is different. Marcus waited. Ethan looked back toward Logan, who was still standing exactly where they had left him. If somebody keeps pushing you, what do you do? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the old family photograph resting inside his open canvas bag before carefully placing it back beneath his books. Then he closed the bag and looked at Ethan. You always leave people a chance to walk away. Ethan frowned. And if they do not? Marcus looked through the small window at the fading light outside the prison walls. His voice remained calm, almost gentle. Then you help them understand why they should have. High above the block, Officer Daniel Ross felt a chill run through him. 20 years earlier, beneath bright arena lights and the sound of thousands of cheering voices, he had heard that exact sentence spoken by a champion who never celebrated victory. And standing there in the quiet control room, he finally realized that the man he had been searching for all these years was sleeping in cell 27. The following morning arrived with a strange feeling hanging over C Block. Nothing had changed on the surface. The same steel doors opened at the same hour. The same voices echoed through the hallways. The same routines guided every movement inside Redstone Correctional Facility. Yet Ethan Brooks could feel that something invisible had shifted. He walked beside Marcus Carter toward the breakfast line and noticed that more inmates were watching the quiet new transfer than ever before. Some offered a silent nod. Others simply stepped aside to let him pass. Marcus acknowledged each one with the same calm smile. Ethan leaned closer. People are treating you differently. Marcus looked around the corridor. People often see things when they are ready to notice them. Ethan laughed quietly. You could answer a weather report with a life lesson. Marcus smiled, but said nothing. Across the cafeteria, Logan Hayes sat at his usual table, but his attention was fixed on Marcus. The words from the night before refused to leave his mind. You always leave people a chance to walk away. Logan had spent years believing that strength came from forcing people into corners. Yet the older man seemed to believe exactly the opposite. One of Logan's friends placed a breakfast tray on the table. You are thinking about him again. Logan looked up. Do you know what bothers me? The other inmate shook his head. Logan glanced toward Marcus. He never acts like he has anything to prove. The answer lingered between them. Up in the administration office, Officer Daniel Ross stood beside Warden Michael Grant, holding the old magazine and a sheet of printed notes from his conversation with Richard Cole. The warden looked at the faded photograph one more time. You really believe this is him? Ross nodded slowly. Richard did not even hesitate. The warden folded his arms. Tell me exactly what he said. Ross looked out through the office window toward the cafeteria below. Marcus was sitting with Ethan, quietly turning the pages of his book while waiting for breakfast to begin. He said there was never anybody better. Grant looked surprised. Better than who? Ross took a slow breath. Everybody. The warden looked back down at the transfer file lying on the desk. Marcus Carter. Ordinary intake records. Ordinary sentence information. Nothing special. Yet the man sitting below looked nothing like the paperwork in front of him. Grant finally asked the question that had been bothering him since Marcus arrived. If he really was that famous, why does nobody know his name? Ross thought about the old warehouse arena, the cheering crowd, and the champion who had stayed behind to help workers clean up after everyone else had gone home. Maybe he never wanted them to. After breakfast, the inmates were assigned their daily work details. Marcus and Ethan were sent to organize supplies in the education wing. Old boxes filled with donated books and classroom materials covered the floor. Ethan picked up a dusty history textbook and smiled. I guess this is better than kitchen duty. Marcus nodded. Every job matters to somebody. As they worked, one of the storage shelves shifted slightly under the weight of several heavy boxes. Ethan reached toward it, but Marcus gently raised one hand. Wait. Ethan stopped immediately. Marcus stepped forward and carefully adjusted the stack until everything settled back into place. Not a single box fell. The entire movement took only a second. Ethan looked at him with wide eyes. How did you know? Marcus brushed a little dust from his sleeve. Things usually tell you what they are about to do if you pay attention. Unknown to them, Officer Daniel Ross had been standing in the hallway outside the storage room. He had watched everything through the open door. Again, there had been no panic, no wasted motion, only timing and control. Ross slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out the small note Richard Cole had given him over the telephone. Written across the top were 6 simple words. Watch the way he reads a room. Ross looked back toward Marcus. The older man was helping Ethan carry another box across the floor, talking quietly as though nothing unusual had happened. Suddenly Ross understood. It had never been about speed. It had never been about strength. The champion Richard Cole remembered had been famous because he always seemed to know exactly what would happen before anyone else did. And standing there in the quiet hallway of Redstone Correctional Facility, Daniel Ross realized that the mystery was no longer whether Marcus Carter had once been that man. The real mystery was why someone like him had chosen to disappear from the world in the first place. By the end of the afternoon, the quiet mystery surrounding Marcus Carter had spread beyond C Block and into the administration offices. Guards who had barely noticed the new transfer a few days earlier now found themselves watching him during routine rounds. Nobody could explain exactly why. Marcus never caused trouble. He never raised his voice. He simply moved through the prison with a calm confidence that seemed completely out of place. Ethan Brooks noticed it too as they carried another cart of books back toward the library. People look at you differently now, he said. Marcus adjusted the stack carefully before answering. People usually see what they are ready to see. Ethan smiled. I think they are trying to figure out who you used to be. Marcus stopped outside the library door and looked through the window at the old shelves inside. Who a person was matters less than who they choose to become. Ethan had heard many lessons from the older man, but this one stayed with him longer than the others. Inside the library, Mrs. Eleanor Price greeted them with her usual warm smile. Perfect timing, she said. I have another donation box that needs sorting. Marcus set the books down and immediately started helping. Old novels, history books, and biographies filled the box. As he carefully arranged them on the shelves, Mrs. Price picked up a faded sports biography and laughed softly. I never understood why people get so excited about champions. Marcus looked at the old cover for a second before handing it back to her. Most people are not really cheering for victory. Mrs. Price looked curious. Then what are they cheering for? Marcus smiled gently. Hope. Outside the library, Officer Daniel Ross stood quietly in the hallway. He had not meant to listen, but the conversation had reached him through the open door. The old correctional officer closed his eyes for a moment. Suddenly, another memory returned. The warehouse arena. Thousands of people standing shoulder to shoulder. A young fighter entering beneath bright lights without music or celebration. The crowd had not been cheering because they wanted to see someone lose. They had been cheering because they believed they were watching someone special. Ross opened his eyes and looked through the library window. Marcus was placing books back onto the shelves with the same care he had once shown inside that ring. Warden Michael Grant approached from the end of the hallway. Richard Cole called again. Ross turned toward him immediately. What did he say? The warden handed him a small note. Richard was coming to Redstone. Ross looked down at the message. His heart began beating faster. When? Tomorrow morning. Grant folded his arms. He told me there is only one reason a man like Marcus Carter would disappear from that world. Ross looked back toward the library. Did he tell you what it was? The warden slowly shook his head. He said Marcus would tell us himself if he ever wanted anyone to know. Down in the library, Ethan noticed Marcus staring at an old photograph tucked inside one of the donated books. It showed a father teaching a young boy how to ride a bicycle. Marcus looked at it quietly before placing it back between the pages. Ethan smiled. You miss your family? Marcus nodded once. Every day. Ethan lowered his voice. Do they know where you are? Marcus looked toward the narrow window where the late afternoon sunlight was beginning to fade. The people who matter always know where to find you. Before Ethan could ask another question, the evening movement bell echoed through the prison. Inmates began leaving the education wing and heading back toward their cells. Marcus picked up his canvas bag and walked into the corridor. Logan Hayes was waiting near the staircase. This time he was alone. The two men stood facing each other while the rest of the block slowly moved around them. Logan looked at Marcus for several seconds before speaking. I have spent days trying to understand you. Marcus waited patiently. Logan glanced toward the library behind them. Everybody keeps telling me that strength means making people afraid. Marcus looked down the quiet hallway. And what do you think? Logan took a slow breath. I think you are the strongest man I have ever met, and I have never seen you make anybody afraid. Marcus smiled softly. Fear is easy. Trust takes much longer. Logan lowered his eyes for a moment, then stepped aside without another word. Officer Daniel Ross watched the entire exchange from the upper level. Tomorrow Richard Cole would arrive at Redstone. Tomorrow the man who had trained the greatest underground champion he had ever seen would walk through those prison gates. And deep inside, Ross already knew exactly who Richard had come to find. The next morning began earlier than usual for the staff at Redstone Correctional Facility. Warden Michael Grant stood near the front entrance with Officer Daniel Ross, both men watching the empty road that curved toward the prison gates. Neither of them spoke very much. The quiet carried the weight of unanswered questions. Ross still held the old magazine in one hand. The faded photograph had become worn from being opened and closed so many times over the past few days. Finally, a dark sedan appeared beyond the outer fence and slowly approached the security checkpoint. The vehicle came to a stop, and an elderly man stepped out carrying a small leather bag. His hair had turned almost completely silver, but his posture remained straight. Daniel Ross recognized him immediately from the old newspaper articles he had found. Richard Cole, the man who had trained some of the finest underground competitors in the country. Richard looked at the prison building for several seconds before turning toward the warden. Thank you for letting me come. Warden Grant shook his hand. You came a long way. Richard smiled faintly. Some journeys take years. Ross stood quietly beside them. Richard noticed the old magazine under his arm and nodded. You found it. Ross handed it to him. Richard looked down at the faded cover and gently brushed his hand across the photograph. I have not seen this in a very long time. The three men walked slowly through the administration building. Along the way, Grant finally asked the question that had been waiting since the first telephone call. Was Marcus Carter really your fighter? Richard stopped walking. He looked through the hallway window toward the prison yard below where inmates were beginning their morning routines. No, he answered softly. He was never my fighter. Ross looked surprised. Richard smiled as though remembering another life. I only taught him a few things. The rest came from who he already was. Down in C Block, Marcus Carter was helping Ethan Brooks organize books for the education program. Ethan looked at the clock on the wall. You ever think about leaving this place? Marcus slid another book onto the shelf. Everybody thinks about leaving. Ethan smiled. I mean really leaving. Marcus looked toward the narrow window where the morning sunlight stretched across the yard. A person can leave a place without ever walking away from it. Ethan frowned. I'm not sure I understand. Marcus picked up another book and handed it to him. Most lessons take time. At that same moment, Officer Ross opened the library door. Marcus looked up and offered the same calm smile he always did. Ross stepped aside without saying a word. Richard Cole slowly walked into the room. Mrs. Eleanor Price stopped arranging books behind the desk. Ethan looked from the older visitor to Marcus, sensing that something important was happening. Richard stood only a few feet away. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Marcus studied the older face, and then a gentle smile appeared. You still carry that old bag. Richard looked down at the leather case in his hand and laughed quietly. You told me good things should last. Ethan looked at Marcus in disbelief. You know him? Richard never took his eyes off Marcus. Know him? His voice grew softer. I spent 10 years watching this man do things that should not have been possible. The library became completely silent. Even Mrs. Price had stopped moving. Officer Ross stood near the doorway with his hands folded, feeling as though he were watching history return after being forgotten for decades. Richard took one slow step closer. I searched for you after you disappeared. Marcus lowered his eyes for a moment. I know. Why did you leave? Richard asked quietly. Marcus looked around the little library. Old books. Dusty shelves. Ethan standing beside him. Mrs. Price smiling gently behind the desk. Finally, he looked back at the man who had once stood in his corner beneath bright lights. Because one day, I realized people only remembered who won the match. Richard waited. Marcus rested one hand on the shelf beside him. I wanted to become someone worth remembering after the cheering stopped. Richard's eyes filled with emotion. He slowly shook his head and smiled. I told everyone there would never be another champion like you. Ethan looked at Marcus with completely different eyes now. Officer Ross closed the old magazine and quietly slipped it under his arm. The mystery that had followed the new transfer through Redstone was finally coming to an end. But standing there in the peaceful silence of the prison library, everyone in the room realized that Marcus Carter had never cared whether the world remembered he had been a champion. He had only cared about becoming a better man after he was one. The days after Richard Cole's visit felt different inside Redstone Correctional Facility. Nothing in the official schedule had changed. The count bells still echoed through the hallways. The steel doors still opened and closed with the same heavy sound. Inmates still followed the same routines they had followed for years. Yet Ethan Brooks could feel that the atmosphere around C Block had somehow become lighter. People spoke more quietly. Arguments seemed to end before they started. Even the older correctional officers looked less tired as they walked their rounds. Marcus Carter never mentioned what had happened in the library. The old paperback book returned to its usual place beneath his arm, and every morning he could still be found helping organize shelves before breakfast. Ethan stood beside him one afternoon, placing donated books into alphabetical order. "Everybody knows now," he said. Marcus slid another novel into place and smiled. "Everybody knows a story." Ethan looked at him. "You were one of the greatest champions anybody had ever seen." Marcus glanced across the library. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, touching the old wooden shelves with a soft golden light. "That was only one chapter." Ethan shook his head. "Does it not bother you that people forgot?" Marcus looked down at the book in his hand before placing it carefully on the shelf. The people who mattered never forgot. Across the room, Mrs. Eleanor Price smiled quietly as she listened. Officer Daniel Ross stood outside the library door during his afternoon round. He had returned the old magazine to a small box in his office. Somehow it no longer felt important. For years he had carried that memory without understanding why. Now he realized that the most remarkable thing about the old champion had never been what happened beneath bright lights. It was what happened after they were turned off. Warden Michael Grant joined him in the hallway. "Richard left this morning." Ross nodded. "Did he say anything else?" The warden looked through the library window toward Marcus. "Only one thing." Ross waited. Grant smiled faintly. He said Marcus was never trying to become the strongest man in the room. He was trying to become the kindest. Down in the library, Ethan looked toward the window overlooking the prison yard. Logan Hayes was standing outside alone, watching the autumn leaves drift across the concrete. "I think he wants to talk to you," Ethan said quietly. Marcus closed the book he had been reading and walked outside. Logan turned as he approached. For a moment, neither man spoke. The same prison yard where they had first measured each other with silent questions now seemed strangely peaceful. Logan finally broke the silence. "I spent most of my life thinking people respected me because they were afraid." Marcus waited patiently. Logan looked down at his own hands. "Now I think they were only waiting for somebody better to follow." Marcus shook his head gently. "People are not looking for someone perfect." Logan looked up. "Then what are they looking for?" Marcus smiled. "Someone who reminds them they can become better too." Logan let out a slow breath and looked toward the high fences surrounding the yard. "Do you think a man can really change?" Marcus followed his eyes to the open sky beyond the walls. "A person changes the moment he decides his future matters more than his past." Logan stood quietly for another second before offering his hand. Marcus shook it with the same calm smile he had carried since the day he arrived. Ethan watched the moment from the library window and realized that no fight had ever happened between them. Somehow the quiet old man had won without trying to defeat anyone at all. That evening, after final count, Marcus sat alone near the library window with his favorite book resting in his lap. The prison had grown quiet. Outside, the last light of day faded behind the distant hills. Ethan walked over and sat beside him. "Can I ask one final question?" Marcus smiled. "You have been saving that one." Ethan looked at him carefully. "After everything you accomplished, after all those people cheering your name, what mattered the most?" Marcus looked through the window toward the darkening sky. For a long time he said nothing. Then he opened the old family photograph inside his canvas bag and looked at it with a gentle smile. "One day the cheering stops," he said softly. "The titles disappear. The trophies gather dust. In the end, the only thing that stays with you is the number of lives you helped stand a little taller." Ethan looked out across the quiet prison yard and finally understood why Richard Cole had searched for Marcus Carter for so many years. The greatest champion had never been the man who stood alone beneath the brightest lights. He had been the man who quietly helped others find their own.